Okay, welcome everybody. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Anne Driver. I have enjoyed working in the fascinating world of insurance for over 35 years. Currently, I'm a partner at Deloitte and their global IFRS-17 general insurance lead. But over recent years, I've been involved in the development and delivery of IFRS-17 through membership of the IASB's Transition Resource Group, in my role as chair of the Australian equivalent Transition Resource Group, and actually through a seat on the Institute of Actuaries Task Force on AASB 17, as we know it here, so spending a lot of time with actuaries. Throughout my career, I've had the pleasure of working closely with many actuaries, and I thank you for inviting me here today. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank our platinum sponsors, RGA, Silverman, and Actuaries. Thank you for your support. So, IFRS-17, what we're here to talk about. It's been in development for a number of years. The go-live date was 1 January 2023, so across many countries, companies are now actually producing real results on an IFRS-17 basis, and many others are looking to follow across the globe as their application dates approach. Broadly speaking, we're seeing quite significant impact, as you'd expect, in the life insurance space, and relatively less impact in the non-life sector. We've seen wide use of the three measurement models within the standard, so the general measurement model, the premium allocation approach, or simplified approach as it's known, and the VFA, or variable fee approach. The discussion of the complexity of interpretation, which featured in the earlier years in our ISB Transition Resource Group meetings, through ISB board discussions, and more recently in the ISB's Interpretations Committee, has now been shifting to talking about how do we explain our results on an IFRS-17 basis, not just internally in companies, but to a very broad range of stakeholders. And we've seen then the subsequent analysis and interpretation of these results, starting with analysts and investors. Without a doubt, the introduction of IFRS-17 has challenged actuaries and accountants alike. It's also shone a light on, I think, some existing practices and products, sometimes with surprises. It's also delivered a learning curve in terms of new and common languages and common ways of producing financial statements across this countries and the different parts of the insurance sector. So we're going to hear from 4 different presenters today who bring very different lens to the IFRS-17 journey. Let me introduce our panelists. Our rock star from the accounting world, Dr. Andreas Barckow, is chair of the International Accounting Standards Board, starting his term in July 2021. Prior to this role, Andreas was president of the Accounting Standards Committee of Germany, and Andreas is acknowledged as being an expert in IFRS-17 from all those different angles that IFRS-17 comes, over many years of experience. Marika Guralnik is head of actuarial and insurance technical services at Compensa Life Vienna Insurance Group, which operates across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Marika has been leading the actuarial division at Compensa Life since its inception in 1997, and as a member of its executive board, has overseen actuarial, finance, and IT services in the company. Marika has been leading the implementation of IFRS-17 at Compensa Life. Welcome, Marika. Now, Nick Dexter. Have we got Nick?
Yeah.
There you are. Welcome, Nick. Nick Dexter is chair of the International Actuarial Association's Insurance Regulation Committee. He's a member of their Climate Risk Task Force as well. Until the end of 2022, Nick was a senior advisor of the UK's Prudential Regulation Authority, the PRA. His principal area of expertise is in insurance, and he advised the PRA's supervision teams on technical areas such as Solvency II, climate risk, IFRS-17, and insurance more generally. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you.
Tony Silverman, our final presenter, is a director of the credit rating criteria research and analytics at AM Best. As a director at AM Best in London, Tony is primarily concerned with the generation, implementation, and maintenance of insurance leading and globally consistent credit rating criteria for the insurance sector. Tony cites a special interest in insurers' external financial reporting and the macroeconomic and social role of insurers. So this is particularly relevant for our discussions today. Welcome, Tony. Tony, can we hear you?
Yes, I've switched it on.
Okay,
Hi,
we've got two Nicks on the screen. Great if we could get one Tony and one Nick. Thanks, guys. So in our session today, Andreas is going to take us through his perspective on what we can expect from IFRS 17 results. And this is going to be followed by 3 10-minute segments where each of our other panelists will give their different points of view from their roles as preparer, Marika, from our regulator, Nick, and from our analyst, Tony. So then we're going to shift to a Q&A session. I'll start by quizzing Andreas. But please, as you listen to the presenters, do put your questions into the app. It's the ICA2023 app. I think you should all be pretty familiar with it by now. But at the bottom of the Watch Live page is a question section, so you can submit your questions for the speakers. If you have a particular focus to a preparer or a regulator or analyst or to Andreas, please do put that at the beginning of your question if you prefer me to direct it directly to them. And as you enter your questions, I will pick them up from the iPad here as we get to the Q&A. We can use a microphone in the room as well for those that prefer that. On that point, Andreas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I don't know what you expect from a rock star, and I'm not really sure I can live up to that. Not that I'm not into rock music, I'm more into classical music, but I don't think that you want to hear me singing anyway. I would like to start by acknowledging the organizers and the sponsors. I feel very honored that I've been invited as a non-actuary actually to this illustrious group. And I feel very proud to be presenting and speaking to you. Now, I could happily dissociate myself from anything that I will be reporting on. I could say it was all the old board's fault because, as Anne said, I'm just about to enter my second year or finish my second year at the standard setter. But I must say that I have little reason to actually dissociate myself from the end result because I truly think that IFRS 17 has been a game changer. And you know what? Actually, this year, the standard will be admitted to elementary school because the standard has just turned 6. So obviously we realize the standard has had a long life, the longest life in standard development, even by our terms. You take it all together, it probably was an over 20 years journey that we have come through. And it wasn't anticipated as being such a long story, but it didn't come completely as a surprise because the jurisdictions were vastly different in how they treated insurance operations, insurance results. There was basically no comparability whatsoever, and each company was given a huge leeway in presenting how they believe they could best portray their business and performance, which on a standalone basis, there's nothing to say against that. But if you're working on a global basis as an investor, you give them actually a very hard time in comparing apples with apples and pears with pears. So the whole starting point was really, is there a way that we can bring about and develop a global standard for insurance accounting? Now, a lot has happened, obviously, over the last 25 years. There have been numerous changes, both in the environment. We've gone through a massive, not only one financial crisis, you have had the Asian crisis over here. We had a new regime in terms of prudential oversight in various countries and to various degrees that had a tremendous impact. And obviously, we wanted to reflect all these latest developments and making the standard as representationally faithful as possible. Now, time will tell, history will tell whether we have done a good job or not. And although I like really being with you here in the room and having an in-person meeting, there is one benefit of virtual presentations. The amount of eggs being thrown at me is limited. So We have produced 2 exposure drafts, 1 discussion paper before the standard was finally issued in 2017. Most people tend to forget a little bit about 2017 because they think of the latest version where we have made some amendments. And it was actually Anne's and my fault probably in our previous jobs that actually has given rise to some of these changes, because we have worked in our respective constituencies and with our stakeholders in addressing some pragmatic points that have come to the fore very early on. And we flagged those to the IASB, and obviously at that time we were quite appreciative that they have accommodated it. Whether the final standard meets the cut, we will need to see. But let me really start by saying and re-emphasizing what the core point of the project was. The core point and the objective was not to make life harder for everyone in the room. It was not to produce the most costly standard that we could bring about. It was not to make you angry in any way. It had one very simple objective: to develop a global standard, and the first truly global standard in insurance accounting. To achieve 2 things that investors were missing at that time. Firstly, to be able to compare insurance companies doing business in insurance around the globe, and to compare insurance companies with companies in other industries. Now, you may say, from your perspective, that's a rare breed because the majority of users are really industry-focused, and that may well be true. But there are some generalist users, actually, that do compare financial services companies with companies that come from other corporate sectors. So that was really our key objective. And the question was, how could we achieve that? The first comment that we always got was, well, insurance is special, right? So we know that it is special, but can you please tell me, is it so special that you deserve a special accounting treatment? So obviously the board was trying to make analogies to banks accounting, to financial instruments accounting, to other long-range events and transactions that are already catered for in the accounting standards. And we came to the agreement, yeah, probably there is nothing that exists today that would depict transactions on a current basis. And that is another cornerstone of this standard. Don't work on old locked-in assumptions, but really have updates and current estimates being factored in so as to give an honest and faithful representation of where the insurance company is based on all the contracts they have locked in the past. So let me start by pointing out some benefits, even for the insurers, although we heard a lot of complaints in the beginning about all the difficulties and all the cost that is involved. And we don't want to play that down. I mean, we are aware this has been a massive change. Some stakeholders have actually said, well, now you're really applying IFRS for the first time, because many of your system changes that we ask you to do in order to facilitate the insurance accounting, many other companies that have moved on to IFRS did when they first onboarded to IFRS, which also came with massive system changes. But the majority of your systems only changed actually with this standard. In particular, I should also mention not just with IFRS-17, but also with IFRS-9, which was applied concurrently. So the majority of your balance sheet obviously was affected. The key benefit that we have heard after the dust settled a little bit is, well, you've now given us a tool that enables us to speak the same language within the company. You bring together risk managers, actuaries, the business salespeople, and the accountants that work from the same principles, that use the same language, and for the first time, really, the first understanding of the same issues. Probably the accountants were really the left behinds. They were probably the ones that were the furthest away from the true business and from the actuarial profession. They took whatever you gave them, and then they made some sense of that. At least that was the hope. Now we have given you, I think, a toolkit that speaks far more to how a business is being run. It may not exactly mirror it, but it comes closer as to how the business risk is being managed. And we think that is a huge contribution because it gives you and empowers you not only to speak the same language, but also to make better informed decisions, business decisions internally. And given that you are able to do that, you arguably should have an easier way to communicate your results, your risk management, your strategy to the outside world and to outside investors. And if we were able to achieve that at a reasonable cost, then I think I could say that we have fulfilled our mission. So what are the first things that we are hearing out in the market? As Anne has just alluded to, the standard went live 1st January this year, and the major insurance companies have just produced their first quarterly results and have been announced in mid-May. And obviously everybody was eagerly waiting, what do the figures say? And is it easier or less easy to actually explain the numbers? Now you could say the big companies obviously have done a tremendous job in the years before the go live, because they've actually prepped the market, right? You wouldn't just throw the new numbers over the fence and said, okay, here it is, right? But you want to prepare the insurers and saying, well, our results will henceforth be structured slightly differently than you're used to. This is how we will be presenting those numbers. This is the narratives that you will see accompanying these numbers. And I think users not only appreciated being taken by the hand and being led through that journey, but also being presented with those results. There was really no punishment whatsoever, on the contrary. The numbers that we have seen and we have tracked, I would say probably the global top 20 that have come out, have all been really appreciated for the clarity of the numbers, for what analysts were being told in the years before, and how this actually then panned out in real numbers. And that obviously was exactly what we have hoped for. Does that mean that the standard is picture perfect? Job done, thank you very much, can fly back to London? Probably not. And it would be a surprise. I mean, if something had been developed over 25 years, it just shows that obviously there is a lot of change going on, both within the industry and outside of the industry. There are geopolitical developments that you somehow need to factor in. There are changes in regulation and all sorts of that. So I think we are eager to learn over time, together with you, where the standard actually is working as intended, it is working well, where it is working, but at a cost that's not really commensurate to the benefit it conveys, and where there are gaps that weren't contemplated when the standard was developed, so arguably there may be a need of actually putting out further amendments. Now, I want to caution you a little bit. You may have your hobby horse, and you may know exactly which point you want to change. Be aware, we are a global standard setter. If we contemplate making your change, we are affecting every insurer in 140 plus jurisdictions, whether they want to see the change or not. And that is the big challenge of a global standard setter. The big difference between a national and a global standard setter. I've worked as a chair of a national standard setter before. It's a rather easy job because you're working against the same socioeconomic and legal background for everyone in the system. If you're dealing with that on a global scale, and there is no global consistency in all the other fields that I have mentioned, in prudential regulation, in taxation, in business development, and all sorts of that, it wouldn't be a surprise to see that actually there are different appreciations of certain accounting treatments. It will fit better in some circumstances than another. But we can't have one standard with 20 variations. There's only one standard. So we have to be diligent as and when we actually are pursuing any changes, and I'm happy to actually elaborate a little bit more on that. My last comment is just on a little sad note, because I've started on a high note, I'm going downward. We have been made aware that there are several jurisdictions that have postponed the effective date of IFRS-17, and that obviously is a pity. We thought that almost 6 years it should have been sufficient, but it proved not to be. So whether that's lack of resources that are available in a certain jurisdiction, where there is a less developed market and you only have a few handful insurance companies that are complex enough to actually absorb all the consulting expertise that may or may not exist. Whether it's for other reasons, whether it may be due to economic environment more generally that jurisdictions have made that decision. We acknowledge that it isn't an easy task, and we are obviously standing ready to help people in onboarding on the standard. But it would be a disaster if in the end we've produced that standard over that time span to just see that the biggies are now on IFRS 17 and all the rest of the market is somewhere either not following or doing something different or only very much later. So we hope to be able to bring them on board. I've used up the majority of my time contrary to what I said before. Back to you, Anne. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andreas. Some good food for thought there, and we'll be getting some good questions to you in a minute, I think. Marika, can I invite you up, please, to talk from a preparer's perspective of what it's like to go through IFRS 17 implementation?
Thank you, Andreas, for your excellent presentation. And obviously, the expectations toward preparers are quite high, and it is important to understand what the new regime will bring along and how the results will be interpreted. But I would like to focus on here and now. So we are trying to get the implementation done, and that will continue like that for some time. So yeah, let me share another side of the story. So I'm Marika, and I'm representing Compensa Life, which is part of Vienna Insurance Group. So that's important to mention. So maybe you'll hear about that later in the presentation. And so today is the day. May 31st is the day when Compensa Life is supposed to publish its first official IFRS 17 report. So we have still some hours to go in Europe, so let's see if that will happen. So my accounting team is sure that everything is on track, but okay, let's see. And to put my remarks in context, so as Anne mentioned, I'm leading the actuarial services, and I'm leading the IFRS 17 implementation of the company. And it's a composite company. We do have non-life insurance, but we are focused more on the life and long-term savings, so that makes it more complicated. And we are operating in 3 countries, which makes it even more complicated. And we started our implementation in second half of 2018 together with the group. About the same time, I joined the IAA task force on IFRS 17 actuarial standard. And frankly speaking, after all those years with IFRS 17, I can admit that more I deal with this topic, less I know and understand. So when I was invited to speak on the Congress, I first thought about, oh my God, what I could share, what kind of exciting insights I could talk about from the stage. Because my experience should be quite common for all market players. So everyday reality, everybody is dealing with the same thing, nothing interesting. But I talked to my colleagues from the industry, and indeed, our experiences are in common. But most of them admitted that they have a feeling that they are left by themselves. Like everybody has sought everything already out, and we, including us, are the worst ones. Nothing is done. We don't understand how to do it. So I will discuss those issues. We are listed on the slides today. I will try to suggest maybe some ways how to address those issues, and I will try not to complain too much. So indeed, with the new standard, we're supposed to speak one language to allow all stakeholders to understand the insurance companies' reports in the same way. But the reality, at least based on my experience, is very different, though. Insurance companies, together with their consultants, they do interpret the principle-based standard in very different ways. So let me give you one example. The same unit-linked contract is treated by one insurance company as insurance contract under IFRS 17, while the another company on the same market with the same agreement conditions treat the same policy under IFRS 9 as the investment contract. So how could we compare those kind of reports? And these different interpretations, they show up also in audits. And frankly speaking, some of these talks with audits, they remind me like the story of three blinds discussing the elephant. And it may repeat again when we change the auditor. So my gut feeling is the full audit next year will be a lot of fun for all of us. And so it seems that if the same principles of the same standard are applied so differently, so the standard goal is a bit at risk. So as an industry, you may need to capture best practices for the standard interpretation and calculations. It could be a good topic for like IAA task force in the future as well, so to get along. So yeah, the Babel Tower, and another problem that we all know that actuaries are gods of Microsoft Excel. But new regime just literally killed the Excel stars. So we became fully dependent on the IT function, on the new softwares for data processing, calculation, producing reports. And Excel is now used only for the presentation of the final result. We have to process every cohort by themselves, separately. So that obviously increases the data set we have to process. As a result, all computations, they're taking much more time, many steps. If we are making mistake in any parameter table or any input data, so we have to rerun everything from the scratch, and that takes really hours and hours. So the change in the IT environment is not just the increase of IT resources or costs. It has, at least for now, changed completely the actuarial process itself. So instead of analyzing data and the result, we're just busy getting the result itself. Looking to the bright side, so letting Excel go pushed us to the 21st century. So there is no way back. And we really need to continue to invest in IT. But I think that a big part of that investment should go to tools that help us to minimize those errors and build up all kinds of data quality checks on the input side and the output side. So, and now I think the most important topic I would like to handle today is we are getting the IFRS report out of the IT system, and we don't have an easy way to know if it's possible or not. So we may get 10 million in profit and think, well, that makes sense. And then it turns out it's 15 million loss. And after some thought, yeah, that makes sense too. So with IFRS 17, actuaries just struggle to explain all numbers the same easy way as we have done before. So at least for now. So for sure, we are early in the process, so we don't have enough history and experience so to feel the data. And from their side, accounting is struggling to understand why this and that number is so different from IFRS 4 report. We are trying to use Solvency II and IFRS 4 numbers to cross-check some of the results where we see it's feasible. But frankly speaking, there is a limited understanding how all the new frameworks should relate. So actually we really need to get the old IFRS 4 regime go and stop trying to understand IFRS 17 results in IFRS 4 metrics. So another topic I wanted to mention is that actuaries traditionally, they use a lot of common sense and expert judgment to validate the result. But IFRS 17 is so complex that we really need to supplement our expert judgment with modern developed tools and methods. So The full impact of IFRS 17 is not understood or seen here yet. But there are some topics which are clear for us already, so I briefly mentioned those. So the new standard offers the new view on the profitability, and that may reveal challenges and opportunities. And two main things affecting that profitability are actuarial assumptions, of course, and the cost allocation. So the cost allocation between portfolios should be granular enough to avoid the circumstances when one portfolio is just crop subsidizing another portfolio, or one portfolio became onerous by the same mistake. So at the same time, we do not have to overdo the things, so not to do it in a very complex way. So for example, with acquisition costs, we may allocate costs within portfolio based on channel of where the agreement was sold, for example, online or group, so we can use different ways. But at the same time, taking every single invoice and trying to analyze how to allocate this cost is just too much effort, and it doesn't add much value. So let me check what important stuff I haven't shared yet. So in our company, we put a lot of effort historically for the cost allocation topic, and I can admit that it helped us a lot, and so it was much easier now for IFRS 17 that it could be. So if some of the preparers are in the audience, if your company haven't put enough effort to that until today, so this is the time to do that. And because IFRS 17 is so heavily driven by actuarial calculations, so we started to work a bit closer, or much closer, with the functions like accounting and financial controlling. And I feel that actuaries will be more involved now in the steering the business, interpretation of results, and understanding the business performance. But what we need in addition in this area is that we are lacking good KPIs based on the new metrics of IFRS 17 to understand how the business is performed. So to summarize, what's next for us? First of all, indeed, we should start thinking in IFRS 17 language when reporting or steering the business, and that should be done across all functions in the company. Andreas, you're right. For this to happen, we need to gain some confidence in our results, and so that will come with time, but in addition, we need some tools and methods to validate. And cooperation with the accounting function and financial function is also the key word here. Secondly, we should align all our business and its performance management with the new regime and new reporting metrics. Next year, audit will be a very important milestone, and I hope that a lot of issues and errors will be shaken off by that time or resolved during the audit. Finally, we need to establish industry-wide best practices, I think, to allow us really to speak one language. So I think we all must realize it's a very long way to go. It's a marathon, not sprint, but we will get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marika. There'll be a few accountants and auditors in the audience here and listening online who'll be thinking about that plus 10, minus 15 and how actuaries can justify both. So thank you for that. You also touched on the subject of KPIs, and we're going to be coming to talk to Tony Robinson later. So it'll be really, Silverman later, and so it'll be really good to hear his thoughts on how analysts are looking at it. But our next speaker is our representative of the regulators. Nick Dexter, are you ready to go? Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. Clearly, the transition to IFRS 17 is a major change for insurers, as we've already heard. Inevitably, insurance supervisors need to consider how it impacts both the supervisory framework and the firms they regulate. They need to consider this through two lenses, both the impact on firms through transition and on the ongoing basis post-transition. Generally, supervisors have made various changes in recent years to regulatory requirements, particularly since the financial crisis. Consequently, they have become comfortable with the level of capital held by insurers. So it's not surprising that they would want to maintain that level of capital post-transition to IFRS 17, no matter how they amend their regulatory framework, if at all. Now, a stated aim of IFRS 17 is to improve consistency in financial reporting for insurers. But as Marika has just said, there is a lot of optionality in the standard. Regulators like to have consistency in regulatory reporting, both so they can look at trends over time, but also so they can compare different companies. They also want to be able to aggregate results to identify any build-up of systemic risk. So it is really important that the results that they are receiving or are using are as consistent as far as possible. So a challenge for them in using any of the IFRS results is how to adapt them to be as consistent as possible, at least across different types of insurer. Now, this is not all bad news. Clearly, there is an opportunity for regulators to leverage the information that is produced as a result of IFRS 17. But the challenge is how to utilize that information and how it then reconciles to profits on a statutory basis if that's different. So generally, regulators have reacted to IFRS 17 in two main ways. Now, firstly, they may be very happy with their current solvency framework, for example, under Solvency II. That's certainly where we were in the UK. Then it's a matter of understanding what the impact on insurers is, as there will be aspects which nevertheless flow through into the regulatory returns. For example, there may be an impact on dividend payments or on taxation, both of which typically are based on the accounting balance sheet. Now, a different approach that regulators could take is to take that opportunity to rebase their regulatory framework to use the IFRS 17 balance sheet itself as a starting point for the regulatory returns. Of course, this has the benefit of making it simpler for insurers. And indeed, this is the approach we've seen in some countries, such as in Australia and in Canada. But moving to my last point on this slide, it is likely that some adjustments will be needed to the IFRS 17 results to give the consistency in reporting that regulators would like to see, and to maintain the overall level of capital held by insurers. One common question, for example, is whether any credit should be given to the CSM, and if so, what? Also, what should be done with the risk margin? Is it part of the liabilities, or should it be considered capital? It doesn't mean that the same adjustments need to be made to every category of insurer, but clearly regulators need not only to understand what the capital payments look like on the date of transition, but also how they would vary under different future conditions. I know OSFI in Canada undertook significant field testing to get a good understanding of how their proposals might perform in the future. Next slide, please. Now, moving on to some of the considerations for regulators when they're developing their strategy for IFRS 17. As I just mentioned, supervisors need to consider various aspects of this. What are insurers doing to get ready for IFRS 17? Are there any systemic risks that emerge from this? Is this an opportunity to make some changes to the regulatory framework alongside IFRS 17? These are all good questions. Now, just think about system changes for a moment. As Marika has just said, there have been a lot of potential system changes in firms. This does produce operational risks for insurers in the extensive changes to those systems that are likely to be required, particularly for life insurers. So supervisors will be alert to those risks and want to be aware of the potential consequences. Secondly, any changes to regulatory reporting and data collection will need to be planned and typically consultations had with industry over how that might be achieved. Insurers won't just want to implement IFRS 17, they will also want to optimise their results going forward, including mitigating the potential volatility in emerging profits that some have predicted. In addition, they will want to make implementation less onerous if they can. So in the light of this, some of the changes regulators would be interested in are the organisational changes, such as restructuring, disposal of portfolios, or sales of entities. In some markets, it may be that smaller companies, for example, are sold or restructured to avoid having to comply with IFRS 17, as I understood has happened in Canada. Changes might be made to reinsurance arrangements, given there's a very different approach to reinsurance in IFRS 17 compared to previous accounting standards. Changes might also be made to hedging arrangements. Insurers might want to address some aspects of the new regime, but these may impact the regulatory position. Finally, reinsurers will want to understand whether the company's regulatory capital is significantly affected by any proposed taxation changes. This may only be an issue for certain types of company. In the UK, for example, some insurers had significant deferred tax balances or tax assets, which were impacted by the changes to the tax regime as a result of IFRS 17. So as the regulator, we were keen to understand what the affected companies' plans were to mitigate those impacts. Clearly, there's a lot for regulators to think about as insurers implement the new regime. Next slide, please. Now, there are a number of aspects of IFRS 17 implementation that could have ongoing consequences, both to an insurer's operations and also the supervisory focus. Anyone that has been involved in an IFRS 17 conversion will know how resource intensive this is. But on an ongoing basis, the timetable to produce the results and analyse them is very tight. So regulators will be very aware of the operational risks for insurers. They will also be conscious of the implications for the regulators themselves. I know from my own experience that regulators don't necessarily have the budget to significantly increase the number of actuaries and accountants they employ. So that really needs careful planning for supervisors, how they apply their resources to cope with that. IFRS 17 does potentially give regulators an opportunity to develop certain regulatory processes, including systems and data collection. If there are changes to the regulatory capital regime, that may also give the opportunity to update and align their approach, as, for example, I understood has happened in Australia. Another opportunity for regulators, even if they don't rebase the regulatory regime, is to use the volume and detail in the information that will become available or potentially available. This may be either in the insurer's IFRS disclosures themselves, or maybe the data and information that's produced as part of the financial reporting process. That really is a good opportunity for regulators. And I know in the UK, we're still looking at how we might use that information. Regulators also want to understand any changes that the insurer makes to its ongoing strategy. As part of their ongoing supervisory work, regulators will expect management and boards of insurers to explain how they're using their IFRS results to make decisions in the business. And again, as Marika has mentioned, that is a challenge in itself as boards and management get to understand their IFRS 17 results. And the regulators will surely want to understand that as well. Regulators also want to understand what KPIs insurers are using in an IFRS 17 world, including how management are incentivised, as it's important for regulators to understand if that could cause any conflicts with regulatory objectives. My conclusion is that over the next few years, it will be a challenge for insurers to analyse their IFRS 17 results, but it will also be a challenge for insurers and regulators alike to understand what the results are telling them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. In particular, thank you, because I think it's around 5:30 in the morning over there, isn't it? So well done, covering IFRS 17 that early in the day. You also mentioned KPIs, and we heard Marika talk to this as well. And you know, everybody's working their way through what will those metrics look like. So really interested to hear from Tony Silverman, because you're faced with results coming out right now, Tony, and you have to analyse them, and no one's going to give you a few years to do that. So really interested to hear your perspectives. Are you ready to go now, Tony?
Yeah. If you can have my welcome from me, 5:45 London time, and if you can have my first slide up, please. Good. Yeah, we've got a disclaimer which will test speed reading straight away. Next slide, please. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, that completes that. And then the one after that as well, please. Great. So I've got a very brief presentation. We may catch up a minute or two. As we've already heard, the standard obviously completely transforms external financial reporting. And if you like, unlike the regulators, for many, many markets, it's this financial reporting which is the fundamental input to our own solvency model. But there are one or two very important markets, such as the US, which isn't on IFRS 17 anyway, but also many Canadian companies where it's the regulatory returns that we use. And the Canadian case, they're also closely related to IFRS 17. So it has, but fundamentally it has a pervasive effect, in fact, across all our operations, and it applies to a high proportion of as we say, there are non-US ratings. We're in the same boat as, if you like, as other rating agencies in that respect. I think we're in probably a slightly better position, actually, as a specialist insurance rating agency. We don't have to justify spending, doing whatever's necessary to change our operations to use IFRS 17 as a particular sector. We don't have to answer the question, what do you get out of this? There's never any doubt that we do whatever's necessary to get the best out of IFRS 17. So in that sense, we think the standard actually presents opportunities for us, certainly to demonstrate leadership in the sector, whilst there are risks which perhaps are the things that it's something we have to focus on in the near term. We have to decide on those KPIs. As in this brief presentation, I've not gone through a list, but we have an extensive list. And in fact, it's a richer list than it was before, particularly in the life segment. And in that sense, it's a good thing for us, IFRS 17. And I think that'll become acknowledged more widely. And I'd very much be with the sort of sentiments that Andreas expressed on that. There are, though, risks around identifying the right model inputs. Our solvency model itself does not change. We have to be careful with the inputs. It already works across many accounting standards, and including the many accounting standards embedded within what was IFRS 4. We've got to get all that right, and the other major risk is a huge, in fact, training exercise which has to take place across our business, where we, if you like, have the expertise in IFRS 17, which initially resides in those areas which are involved in transforming our practices and systems and what we do with the data, but that has to filter across to a large number of analysts. We're keeping data on 3,000 insurers actually globally. We might very possibly be the largest single user of this data in any analytical sense globally. Next slide, please. We think the opportunities probably predominate. This is just a few examples of how we're going to use the questions that arise on using the data. Where I should say that this is tested in a few occasions with the Q1 data, but for those largest insurers, where a large number of them are European or UK, the Q1 reporting is a bit, if you like, the phony war, because they're partly in the nature of trading statements, those Q1 results. They're not full data. They don't have, if you like, the note 6 with the roll forward tables. Although in certain territories, we have seen those. The Canadians would be one, and to mention other jurisdictions around the world, the UAE is another where there are full reporting at Q1 under IFRS-17, but that's not really so in Europe. But overall, when this gets going, and the Q1 results, I should say, and as Marika mentioned as well, are not audited around the world. There's the level of audit varies considerably. Generally speaking, they're not really audited, and Q1 trading statements are not audited in the same way as annual results. And the Q1 full data, for example, for the Canadians is not audited generally. We make the point there again that we end up with KPIs and initial data, which is certainly in the life segment and to a more limited extent for P&C, is a richer public set of data, where we as we come on to we always in the existing reporting ask for supplementary data anyway, but we will be asking for a different set of supplementary data going forwards. I'm just going to give some examples here. These are just some. Insurance reporting under IFRS-17 splits for the first time in a required way. Insurance contracts that are, and reinsurance held, that are assets, and the contracts that are liabilities. For various reasons, we're not particularly interested in that split. It's the aggregate, if you like, that goes into our solvency model. We can just take that data and aggregate it. Now, one reason we're not particularly interested in that split is that it, in large part, arises in the first place. The idea that those insurance contracts that are assets, for example, arises from the way IFRS-17 amalgamates credit risk and insurance risk. So payables and receivables on an insurance contract are just part of the present value of future cash flows. We'd want to pull those net payables and receivables out because they're no longer uncertain due to insurance risk. And I think it's actually an unfortunate feature of IFRS-17 that happens. So that will be an AM Best supplementary request. It won't need to be in some cases. We have had some, very constructive, conversations with one or two of the larger insurers, and I think that starting with the H1 results, not in the Q1s we've seen, those net debtors creditors and the total debtors number, which is within insurance contracts, which is also a number of interest to us, may start to appear voluntarily. And I think, well, as Andreas mentioned, there will be a post-implementation review in 2 or 3 years' time, and we'd certainly be interested in that number being a more required disclosure. So that will be a mix, actually, of voluntary disclosure on the part of insurers and our own inquiry. We will be carrying on in the P&C segment with our existing practice of undiscounting the reserves and applying our own discount factor by line in order to create a level playing field so that the different opinions around discount rates don't skew the numerical part of our analysis. So we will be asking for the total amounts of discount by line. And then there's a question around in-force DAC, which is not a required disclosure. The IFRS-17 DAC is this new thing related to acquisition costs attributed to future new business. We'll be asking for that as well. So that just gives a flavour of how the operation of this in terms of incoming data to ourselves as a rating agency, some of the responses that there will be. Next slide, please. I wanted to make, this is really the final active slide, the point that it's possible to get, what's the word, too interested, if that is possible, in the solvency ratio that a rating agency calculates. In our case, it goes by the initials BCAAR, BCAR, Best Capital Adequacy Ratio. There will be changes, of course, to the numerical output. Once you've been pretty careful with the input, if you like, that BCAR ratio may be slightly less sensitive to the change in accounting standards than people may imagine. But there's bound to be some changes, and indeed there'll be changes to other numerical inputs to our analysis, such as the leverage ratios and the combined ratios, which I think is something which could merit a dissertation all by itself, and where practice clearly is starting off varying, in fact, across insurers as to how that's going to be done. But it's a bit like what you might describe as a waterbed that we list within our methodology, quite a substantial list of rating unit review components where the BCAR ratio is only one of them, and I particularly highlight quality of capital there, and where the numerical inputs change, the non-numerical or qualitative assessments are also likely to be impacted in, if you like, the equal and opposite directions. So we're not expecting, as we've said, any automatic nearer term changes in ratings as a result of the change in accounting standard, and the non-numerical bits are part of that. But we do expect that the new insights will evolve over time. It's going to be very difficult to say with certainty whether those insights would have emerged otherwise or not, and those insights will affect ratings over time. I think if I was to cast an opinion over the final bullet on that slide, that the IFRS-17 data set and the KPIs that evolve are indeed richer than they were before, and in that sense, if one could make any comparisons, I don't think you'd be able to pin it down. But there'll be more numerical and less qualitative input as we go forward, so that the numerical input is indeed richer. At that stage, for a 10-minute presentation, I'm going to stop there and hand back to the presenter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, we're going to move to Q&A, and I'm going to start by grilling you, Andreas. I think we've got 10 minutes of roasting you, and then we can move to everyone else. But
I will be well done after that. Yeah.
Now, I want to look at the sort of 3 time horizons, starting now. Marika talked about some of the difficulties of delivering the implementation, and also some of the things coming out of the interpretations, which are still landing differently in different places and with different organisations. First, is this in line with what the IASB expected to happen? And secondly, how should companies and their auditors go about dealing with these differences as we try and kind of nail the standard now?
So thank you for that question. I think it isn't a surprise, put it that way, right? It isn't a deliberate cost that we have put to the system, but we believe that even though accounting has been a trained domain for over 500 years, we know how to do debits and credits. With every new standard, there's rumbles and ruffles, right? And that IFRS 17 is no exception to that. IFRS 17 may be more difficult given the amount of change and the paradigm shift that we've brought to the system. So I would expect that even in a quote-unquote normal medium-sized standard, we expect inconsistencies to exist for 2-3 years after the first annual period. But we also are a strong believer that market forces can sort that out by themselves, because we really hold ourselves to account in producing a principle-based standard. If you want more rigidity, if you want more consistency, the price for it is 1,000 rules. Do you want that? Or do you want a certain degree of freedom, a certain leeway, so that you can fit your own business model under that standard? Now, that comes at a price, right? And there will be questions that are being asked by the auditors, by the supervisors, by others in the ecosystem. But we believe the market is in a position to actually sort that out. And the post-implementation review will actually inform us where the market is not able to sort it out, where there is just remaining inconsistency that's highly detrimental to the users of the reports. And that may be an area where we would then step in. The second question as to different interpretations taken, yeah, again, not a peculiarity to IFRS 17. If you just compare the big books that the large audit firms produce, I mean, you could probably find every accounting variation in those, right? And whilst that may be completely unfortunate because you say, oh, if I change to that auditor, that I may get the accounting treatment I want, I hope that this is not the way how an audit is being perceived, right? Pick and choose and buy your audit. No, it is just an acknowledgement that principle-based accounting standards come with judgment. And there may be areas where the judgment is being exercised differently. But having said that, I've worked in a large audit firm, I've run a technical department, and we have always treated it the way that we said we do have our firm first position, but that doesn't mean that we will roll that out for each and every client. Right? If the client is able to actually portray their facts and circumstances to us, their view may be an acceptable route. It may not be my first best answer, but I can accept that. So there may not be one answer to one accounting question. There may be several answers. That may speak against the consistency in the system, but again, I mean, if there is persistent inconsistency that is coming with a huge detriment, that's then really for us to act. Yeah.
Which takes me on to our next question. Both you and Tony mentioned the post-implementation review. Can you just take us through what that process involves, but also will you have to change it in any way because of this long wave of IFRS 17 application?
That's a good and a tricky question, actually. So the post-implementation review was added to our standard setting process a number of years ago. I colloquially refer to that as after-sales management, right? We don't just throw the ready standard over the fence and say, well, job done, thank you very much. But we actually want to see whether the standard is working as intended. So what we are saying in our due process handbook that binds our processes and our rigorous due process is that we don't start a post-implementation review until 2 or 3 reporting periods have passed. And it's probably the same 2 or 3 periods that I have referred to. Let the markets sort themselves out to see where it is going and how it is working. The PIR is not a project in itself. It's not a standard-setting project. It's a fact-finding exercise. And it's not there to recast all the objections that we have heard in the 25 years before. So it's not another bite at the apple. It's really there. We've taken a decision. We have moved the market. Let's focus on those areas where actually something is utterly wrong, where something is missing, where something is being produced that's not reflective of what we wanted to achieve, and give us the evidence where the standard is not working, or why you believe it is not working. Once we do have all the evidence in front of us, there's a second part to a PIR, which we call a prioritization exercise. We currently do have an agenda of 20 active projects. Now, you have to appreciate that the IASB has a technical staff of roughly 50 people. 50 people are executing 20+ projects. If you want us to pursue your hobby horse, it means that one of the existing projects will have to slow down. And that is the prioritization exercise that we are running. So we are trying to assess, is the issue being flagged to us fatal flaw and producing massive counterintuitive results that require us to act swiftly? Then we will probably prioritize and start the project straight away. If it is of medium priority, we will add it to the list, to, I should say, a long list of issues that we have been asked to look into. And if it is deemed to be of low priority, so it may be relevant only for a couple or a handful of insurers or entities around the globe, then it will probably be ending up a low priority, and we will park it for the next agenda consultation. So the agenda consultation is an exercise that we do every 5 years. We are bound to do that by our constitution, lend our ear to the market, and just reassess what priorities are there, what people want us to do. So that will be the next logical touch point after the PIR. But in the PIR, it's really a fact-finding exercise and seeing, are there any urgent issues that require resolving prior to the next logical agenda consultation.
Okay. Last question, then we'll get to some from the audience. But a few times we've talked about the long period to develop IFRS 17. And obviously you've used things like transition resource group, not just for this standard, but for other ones. From that process, is there any learning that you're bringing out of that into the development of standards in the future? And I'm obviously thinking not just in what's in the IASB's remit, but now we're seeing all the standards coming out of the ISSB, the Sustainability Standards Board. Any learnings that are flowing into that?
Well, the one learning that I could have, and I said I wasn't involved in the development of IFRS 17, so it's easy for me, obviously, to criticize the development. But honestly, in having been exposed to the corporate world, I don't want us to engage in projects that run for 20 years, right? I mean, if I start a project today and say, well, we will see the finishing line in 20 years, the majority of this room will have reached retirement age, right? 20 years doesn't speak to any corporate world, right? If you do strategic planning, you look into 3 to 5 years. Now, let me explain why it is taking so long, not necessarily 20 years, but we say if you do have a robust big standard like primary financial statements that we hope to be finishing soon, it could easily take between 8 or 10 years. Now, it's not because we are moving slow and we don't have any bright ideas. If it was only on us, I would group 5 people of my technical team, lock them into a room and say, you make yourselves known by burning white smoke, and you will be released from that room. That may take 6 to 9 months, and we're done. So where's the difference between 10 years on the one hand side and 6 to 9 months on the other side? It's the stakeholder engagement. Because we don't believe that we have all the wisdom in-house. There's far more wisdom outside of the house, and we want to leverage that. We want to hear what the priorities, what the concerns, and what the wishes are amongst the different stakeholder groups. Now, I said that we serve 140+ jurisdictions. In each jurisdiction, there are preparers who do not think alike. There are auditors who do not think alike. There are users who do not think alike. There are regulators who do not think alike. These are just 4 out of probably even more different stakeholder groups. Times 140 tells you whom you want us to speak to before we actually think about what we are doing. And we are not doing that once, we are doing that on a continuous basis. And that is the investment that we believe brings us to a better result. It slows us down significantly, but it takes our stakeholders by the hand, gives us an opportunity to explain our rationale, listen carefully to concerns that we believe we haven't really appreciated before, and factor that into our standard setting, with the view that ultimately when we get to the end result, we have a better product. So that is why it takes so considerably longer than in the corporate world. But I think it is a worthwhile investment.
Thank you. Now, we've got lots of questions coming through, so I'm going to start to point these at some of the other presenters, but please put your hand up as well if you've got a question in the room. So our first question, I'll point this one at you, Marika. IFRS 17 seems to make results steering more difficult. Do you expect insurers to find a way around this? Or do you think rather it's design-driven and should stay that way, i.e. insurers have less ability to steer their results?
I personally hope that it will have a wider range of possibilities to steer it in the future, because so profitability itself and the new timing of that actually gives a better flavor of, at least for, I'm talking now about the life insurance, a better flavor of understanding the long-term product. And we just still need to find those new ways or those new metrics and KPIs to understand how the real product is reflected now in this IFRS 17 results. So, but yeah, so we are not there yet. Yeah, I have to admit that, just like a gut feeling that there is something in that, so we could get for the future. So, if that's understood the question. So.
A question for Nick. A perfect world for a preparer of financial statements and regulatory returns might be consistency between both of them. And I know the International Association of Insurance Supervisors is out there with a remit to look more broadly across the globe. Do you think there's a future state where there'll be more alignment between regulatory and financial reporting? Nick, did you catch that? Can we just check we've got sound for Nick? Oh, Tony, do you want to take that one, Tony?
He probably wanted to...
Oh, here we go.
Can I be heard? I don't know. Can I be heard?
We've got Nick now. He can take that one. No.
That's not Nick.
Tony, can you still hear us? Would you like to have a shot at answering that?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, two things, if I can get this right. I think the regulatory reporting has become more, they've got a bit closer together in some territories where the regulators have decided to use IFRS 17 based input. If Nick is online, I'm sure he can talk more about that. I mean, I'd like to take the opportunity, if I may, to add something to the question around steering. You know, the unanswered, if you like, question there is steering a good thing or a bad thing? And I'd say that from the point of view of a user, it ain't necessarily a good thing. And one of the advantages of IFRS 17 is the, if you like, when the time comes, the audited and rational amortization schedules for the CSM, which takes it out from under the actuary's hat. I mean, I appreciate this as obviously an actuarial audience, and I'm an actuary myself. But in the grander scheme of what this means to the public face in financial markets of the sector, it's a good thing to see that the CSM is to see it there, and that it has an amortization schedule, if you like. The point being that this tests, if you like, internal versions of the truth become tested externally, if you like, the market pressures that Andreas referred to. And whereas and we'll be able to see more publicly anyway, the differing extents to which profits were taken early or late before, which was, more, within the figures and, if you like, again, under the actuary's hat. And where the establishment of the CSM is, the equity goes down, quote unquote, because the CSM has been established. That's just one, if you like, version of the truth. And there are many territories and products around the world where profit was taken later before than it will be under IFRS-17. And, the opposite is the case. Having a CSM pushes equity up because profit was taken late before. So I think the answer to that question is more nuanced than the insights will emerge over time.
Okay, let's move on. We've got a few more questions to get through. Any in the room that yeah. Okay, do you want to go?
This is Leon from Tao. I have a comment about the IFRS-17's accounting standard. Since it's a principle-based standard, would it be easier if you just leave the details to the different jurisdictions? Because if you want to allow for 140 different jurisdictions, you consider everything, it really becomes just like a universal life covers. It covers everything, but doesn't really work for everyone. That's just a comment. Another question is, we've identified a few efficiencies or flaws in implementing the accounting standard. Most of them related to reinsurance. But in these cases, it's the auditors that dictates the interpretation. What if the auditors are not being reasonable? A simple example is that the auditors requires to group the lump sum or death and income protection business in one group. The reason is that they are covered in the same reinsurance treaty. But we don't really manage the business that way. It's not helping anyone. So in circumstances like this, our hands are tied. How are we going to deal with that to make the new standard helpful and useful?
Thank you. I think that's a good question to hand to you, Andreas. Two parts there. One, why not just leave it to all the jurisdictions? And two, how do you deal with your auditors?
Okay, so am I glad that I'm no longer with the audit firm? So the first question is very easy to answer, and you asked a bold question, you will receive a bold answer. If we left it to jurisdictions, that's the end of global accounting standards. The whole mission of there being global accounting standards was to do away with the differences that existed in jurisdictions. That was the mission of the IASC, right? And we took over from that 23 years ago. So the whole point is actually giving up jurisdiction-specific preferences to establish one global accounting language that leads to comparable information. Now that comes at a price, right? Because not all jurisdictions are the same, and you acknowledge that. But every jurisdiction has to decide whether there is a higher benefit of being part of a global family or wanting to do it their own way. And obviously we are seeing both choices being made, right? The US being a very prominent example, that they want to do it their way, but 140 plus jurisdictions have gone a different way. If we gave in and said, you can have your toy here, what argument do we have for any other accounting standard that we are developing and that we are facing opposition not to give in an accounting choice? That just gets us straight back to where we've all started. And I would really urge us all to think about asking for giving that leeway. That doesn't mean that we have to cover every issue, right? I think the beauty of principle-based standard allows exactly for that. There will be variance. There will be variance in terms of application because the business models are different, the economic environments are different, but the core fundamentals should still be the same. And I think finding that right balance between the specificity that is needed in order to get the concepts and principles being made clear and spelled out, whilst leaving room for interpretation and for application, I think, is the bit that we really try to endeavor. Now, your point about an industry going ballistic, about the interpretation of a standard, well, we talk to the audit profession on a bi-monthly basis, and we are talking to all other constituents in the ecosystem as well. These issues pop up. We try to push back where we can, but we also realize that the audit profession is obviously the first touch point when it comes to certifying and giving assurance over implementation. And they are far closer to the field than we as a standard setter will ever be, right? They are seeing the facts and circumstances on the case, and they will have to make an audit judgment. Now, it may well be true that not all the judgments you agree with, and if they are being presented to us, we may not agree with that. We will have to work that out over time. I don't think there is any good prime recipe how to deal with that. I think it would be completely unrealistic if we said, audit professionals, stop your work, don't opine on that, and refer everything to the IASB, because we wouldn't be able to opine on all of these issues on a reasonably and timely basis, I think.
All right, thank you. Question for Marika. It takes a while to get used to a major new accounting standard and how variations in performance show up in profits and the balance sheet. How long do you think it's going to take with IFRS 17 to get your financially aware insurance executives over the line and have a broad understanding of the accounting consequences of business experience without having to always have technical experts in the room? So how long do you think it's going to take to get your executives, accounting over the line so they don't always have to have technical experts?
So it's all about people, of course, and we do work hard in order to somehow embrace executives in the process. They are eager to understand, but I feel it will be like 2 or 3 processes or rounds done before we really start to understand each other the same way as we do understand, for example, with actuaries and even the financial team. So it will take time, at least I think like 2 or 3 rounds, and it will be very much depending also on specialists working on the project, because the only way executives will learn if they will learn from the specialists who are doing the job. And now the core thing is that the specialists who are now understanding what they're doing most of the times, they do face the communication problem, so they are not able to explain to executives, including myself, what is behind this number and why it is, even if it's intuitively clear for myself. So we need to work on the communication language to transfer the knowledge in the way that it will be understood also by non-accountant and non-financial, non-actuarial executives. So.
Okay. I've got another question that I'm going to direct to you, Marika. So, is the introduction of IFRS 17 of itself likely to cause insurers to change underlying contractual arrangements, e.g., recapturing or restructuring reinsurance arrangements to deal with inconsistencies of contract?
What we have seen so far, so IFRS 17 itself will not cause changes in the products. So, but it rather helps us to see the profitability of the products from different angle, and which it's not necessarily causing the change. Yeah. So I think that before launching the products, those profit testings which we performed, they're actually already in line with the IFRS 17 principal calculation. So it's rather about the additional tool to steer, but not really going to change the products. Of course, if problems in profitability will be revealed during the implementation or will be seen in the results, so that's another story, but not the waiver product design itself. With reinsurance arrangements, I think, at least for now, for our portfolio, the impact of that is not so significant that we would really go deeper. We have many other things to be sorted out before, and so far we were not, at least us, not thinking about any different arrangements, but that's maybe specific for life insurance company, and that might be absolutely different for the non-life sector.
Okay, our next question. Some companies report on an IFRS 17 under US GAAP basis, which now includes these targeted changes from FASB. Is there any chance in the future of FASB and IASB aligning on insurance?
That will be a question that you should be directing to my counterpart in the US, I suppose, right? They're more than welcome to copy. We will discuss the license fees later.
Good answer. Tony, the question here, we heard a credit rating agency talk about supplemental reports that are expected to be requested. The question is, will that drive changes to IFRS 17? But I'd like to add into that question, do we see that to be extensive, the supplemental information that's going to be needed? I could point that to you, Tony.
Oh, right, thank you. Not really not more extensive than what is there already. It'll be slightly different. I might have hoped that was the message from my presentation, but yeah, so it will be slightly different. The only and there'll be things that we're more concerned to get that we might have asked for before that become more relevant, and some things less so. One obvious aspect which we used to be interested in and have to ensure we got, in some cases supplementarily, was a sort of new business margin. Well, there's an audited version of that there in IFRS-17, a version. So there's one aspect where the amount of supplementary information might reduce. Yeah, I think that's where we'd be. I'd make the point again that there are some additions, one of which is this receivables and payables. I think my understanding is that there are some insurers who suggested that should be a required disclosure as well. And it may be that the market forces do indeed sort that out. And if one or two do report those receivables and payables, as they did before, the insurance debtors and creditors, supplementarily in the public reporting, that will become more widespread. Indeed, I hope it will. The other things are. Yeah, there are lots of data items, of course, but I'll leave that there.
I think to the second part of this question, if I can ask you, Andreas, is the supplemental information that will be asked by credit rating agencies, does that flow into your post-implementation review, that sort of stakeholder group?
Well, not necessarily, because we would think that there is certain information that we want to be seen presented in the financial statements, but we don't believe that the financial statements should be treated as an Encyclopedia Britannica, right? They are not the one-stop shop for every answer that you are seeking. They have a specified room, and there's other information available in the market that you need to consult if you do have particular information requests. If there was a clear desire that there was state-of-the-art information that every user would be interested in, but they can't find, and they can't find it in the audited numbers, then we may very well contemplate putting that in. But the question that we would always ask, is there really a deficiency? Is that information not provided elsewhere? And I would ask everyone seriously how reliant you are on data to be audited, right? Because I'm not aware of a single CFO on this planet that is willing to put out a statement in public that he can't back up to his systems, right? Usually the chief accountant would make sure that any financial information that's going to a public audience can actually be traced back to the systems. whether there is an audit stamp on it or whether there is not, right? So I would really question and ask everybody to be serious in their consideration of ask as to how much information you want into the financial statements. Because if you are serious about this, you shouldn't be complaining that the reports get thicker and thicker and thicker. That's just a consequence of that, unless we allow people to reduce the font size, right?
Okay. One last question in the room? Yep. Can we have the microphone down here?
Tony mentioned receivables and payables and problems with those, and I'm aware that that might also be a problem for regulators. So my question, I suppose, is for Nick. What do regulators think about receivables and payables, and is there anything else that they would like to see that isn't expected to be in the IFRS-17 statements?
Yeah, good question. As I think I mentioned, it was sort of as a regulator, we were, and I would caveat that I retired from the regulator at the end of last year, but I don't think their position will have changed yet. We were still waiting in the UK to understand what the results were telling us and therefore what the deficiencies were. And I think most regulators were comfortable prior to IFRS 17 of the information they were receiving, and therefore I wouldn't expect them to, there to be things missing. It's more a question of what additional data is available that we could use. I think the problem with most regulators at the moment, certainly in the Solvency II world, we have too much data, and we're busy trying to look at ways of using AI, other things to actually make use of all the data we get. So there may well be opportunities to develop that, but I think there's plenty of data already available without trying to get insurers to produce more.
Thanks, Nick. Well, that's all we've got time for in terms of questions today. Look, I think it's clear from the discussions, this is not the easiest standard to put in place. We heard Marika to refer to being in the trenches with this one. And I think we saw in terms of both interpretation and application that compliance is probably just a first step. There's an evolution through that to understanding and explaining results. We've heard, yes, there are significant wide-ranging changes to the insurance reporting, but the regulatory environment in some places already started to react to that, and that could go further over time, so one to look out for. Tony provided a little bit of a perspective of people analysing results, and I know I spent probably 2 hours on different calls yesterday listening to people explaining their results, and it's interesting, that's where certainly the benefits are starting to show with that consistency and comparability that you mentioned earlier, Andreas. So I think, yes, there are benefits, but they're probably going to just take a little bit of time for us to really see them. Importantly for all of us to remember is there's a post-implementation review phase for IFRS 17. And although that's a couple of years away, there are various forums, there's lots of education material, and there's lots of learnings coming out of IFRS 17 that people can use in the immediate future to help them progress their journeys. But don't forget about that post-implementation review and think about the things that you think just don't work, but don't think about them from just your very narrow view, but perhaps a broader view about, is this really a pervasive and significant issue? Last but not least, there's a significant opportunity in IFRS 17 for accountants and actuaries to work together. I don't know how well we really handled that. Certainly my perspective in my working career, I've worked a lot with actuaries and I've enjoyed doing that throughout IFRS 17. I always think that the best of us comes out when we work together. So I encourage you all to go back and continue to build your multidisciplinary teams and work together in solving the problems of the future, because we know there's more around the corner, and we know that there are not just more accounting standards coming out, but we're looking to the Sustainability Standards Board into what they're producing next. And without a doubt, I've heard that could be like IFRS 17 on steroids. So be ready and work together to get through it. I'd just like for you all to join me and thank our wonderful panel of speakers. It's great to have you here. And a huge thank you to Marika and Andreas for coming all the way over here to Sydney for this, but also to Nick and Tony for getting up so early in the morning and joining us. Thank you. All right, one last piece of housekeeping before you go. Don't forget to rate the session on your ICA app. And if you're an in-person attendee, don't forget you can track your CPD points by clicking check-in. So don't forget that. Thank you.
Super. Thank you.